Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on US and China and the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. Polaris Live has just begun its third year of operation, and I want to thank our global readership for your confidence in our unbiased coverage of the most consequential relationship of our time and its impact on the world. My guest today is Dr. Weijian Shan. Weijian is the executive chairman and co-founder of PAG, a leading Asia-based and focused investment firm with more than $50 billion in capital under management. Before joining PAG, he was a partner of TPG and co-managing partner of TPG Asia, formerly known as Newbridge Capital, and a managing director of JP Morgan. He was also, prior to that, an assistant professor at the Wharton School, the University of Pennsylvania. Shan also worked at the World Bank and holds an MA and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MBA from the University of San Francisco. He is the author of Out of Gobi, My Story of China and America, Money Games, the inside story of how American dealmakers saved Korea's most iconic bank, and now published a few days ago, The Money Machine, a riveting story of how an American investment firm did the impossible, buyout of an ailing national bank in China, turned it around into one of the healthiest and most profitable financial institutions in the country. Here's the book, and it's available now from all major outlets, hot off the press, and its author now to talk to us, one of his first interviews. Please welcome Dr. Weijian Shan.
Thank you very much, Sarwar, for that very kind introduction.
Well,
Weijian,
you are an amazing person, and your book could not be more timely for business reasons, and I believe for geopolitical reasons, and so on. And your publisher, Weijian, calls your new book riveting. And after reading it, I'd agree. But it also is really three books in one. That's quite a deal, actually. It's three books in one because it's also an explanation of China's complicated government structure and your firsthand account of China opening up to the markets. And I'd just like you to begin by telling us, giving us a snapshot of the book, and why did you call it Money Machine?
Well, the book is a story of how Newbridge Capital, now known as TPG Asia, we rebranded the company as TPG Asia in 2007. At that time was Newbridge Capital, a San Francisco-based private equity firm, how that firm acquired control of a national bank in China called Shenzhen Development Bank, SDB. And I personally led that particular transaction. And it was during what I would call the golden era of China's economic reforms, especially banking reforms. So the story is about how we as American investors took over control of an ailing national bank, which is extremely unusual, is something that had never happened before and has never happened since for a foreign investor to take over control of a national bank in China. And we made a good amount of money out of it. And that's the story.
Machine title is really, first of all, doing the unthinkable, which is buying one of China's national banks, but two, doing it in such a way that that China was left with a bank that was failing, but had been turned around, profitable, and it also made money for the investors. So on both sides, you spun off money for the nation of China and for your own company. Is that a fair description of the title, Money Machine?
Indeed, the national newspaper, upon our exit, described this deal as a triple win. Win for the foreign investor, in this case, Newbridge Capital, and win for the buyer, eventually a Chinese firm, and win for the bank itself. So all around, it was a very successful transaction.
Well, it's just amazing. I couldn't stop reading the book. I mean, it read like a novel, because here we are every day. You get up and you look at the headlines, and it talks about China and America and nothing but fatalistic projections. And one is left away, at least the common American like me, with many, I think, misunderstandings. And let me ask you about one of the things that I really noted in your book. And I'm getting off the money piece of it for just a second. So one of my key takeaways, Weijian, was that China's governance is not as top-down and authoritarian as it is assumed to be. So in the deal you outline in Money Machine, the city of Shenzhen has a government, and then it's in a province which has a government. And of course, China itself has a government. And then there's a parallel party that controls. But just because someone at the top said, this is a really good deal, we need to get this done, didn't mean that the city of Shenzhen would just follow that like a robot. They had their own views. The province had their own views. So am I getting this wrong, that China is not as monolithic, where they press a button at the top and things happen? Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm very interested.
Far from it. I think the timing for this deal to happen was right. The deal happened eventually at the end of 2004, but we started the process in 2002. At the time, China just began its banking system reform, because
Yes.
prior to that, or about that time, the banking system was extremely weak. The central bank, which is called People's Bank of China, that is the central bank, PBOC, estimated that the bad loan ratio in the Chinese banking system was as high as 30%. For all international banks, including Chinese banks, the capital requirements for each of the banks is 8% of the total assets, roughly speaking. So when the bad loan ratio is 30%, that means the bank is many times insolvent, technically. And Standard & Poor, the international, I think US-based international rating agency, estimated that the total amount of bad loans in the Chinese banking system in 2002 was about 50% of GDP, and more than $500 billion at that time. The total GDP of China at that time was about $1.1 trillion. Today is about $18 trillion.
Wow.
So S&P estimated that it would take about 10 years or as many as 20 years to bring down that bad loan ratio from 30% to 5%. Very dismal situation. So the Chinese government, or the central bank, was determined to restructure the banking system by borrowing the best practices from foreign investors like ourselves. It actually cleaned up the banking system by removing the bad loans from the major banks, putting them into asset management companies, and then required all these banks to bring in foreign investors. Not necessarily for the capital, because China at the time, given the high savings rate, was capital rich, but for their skills, their experiences, their knowledge, and their best practices. So it is against this background that Newbridge Capital was invited to buy control of this very troubled bank called Shenzhen Development Bank. So you can imagine policymakers, regulators from top down were very supportive of something happening here. But the ultimate deal had to be negotiated with the local government in Shenzhen. And that's where complexity came in. Different parties had different interests, different preferences. So it was not so easy, even though we had the support from regulators all around, but it took very long time to negotiate the deal. And very often in that process, we felt that the deal was getting away from us. And by the way, even though we were looking at the deal, we were uncertain whether or not it was going to be a good deal. Many people thought that we were foolhardy to try to invest in a very troubled bank in China, which was technically insolvent. So we were worried on both sides, one to lose the deal and the other to do the deal.
Well, thank you for that. And I must tell you that the a very enjoyable part of this bank, I also want to tell our viewers, is the picture you paint, Weijian, of the officials that you dealt with. And the way that you describe them, some athletic looking and so on. I mean, it's such a human story in many ways also. And I suppose I'm right if I ask you that they were feeling their way into open markets, isn't it? Just as you and your team were feeling your way into getting a problem bank out of trouble. I'm sure these people had never encountered this kind of a business deal and business exchanges. They were kind of inventing things as they went along. Would that be a correct interpretation?
That's exactly right. Again, to put things into context, in the United States, a private equity firm is not allowed to control a commercial bank by the Bank Holding Company Act of 1956. And in China, it's similar. A non-bank financial institution is typically not allowed to even invest in the bank, let alone to control a bank. So in order to do this deal, there were some policy breakthroughs. Special approvals were needed for us to control this bank. The only reason that we were invited to look at the possibility of acquiring control of this bank was because we, that is Newbridge Capital, had acquired control of Korea First Bank during the Asian financial crisis a few years back, and we successfully turned around that bank. Because we had that credential, that experience, the regulators in China looked very favorably upon us, knowing that we could be counted on to turn around this very troubled institution. So that was the reason why we were given the opportunity to look at it. But again, some people liked it, some people didn't like it, and it became very complicated.
Well, the book, sometimes I just have to laugh out loud. Sometimes I just couldn't believe what I was reading. For example, in your book, you talk about that you came to a crossroad where everything seemed to stop. People were going back on what you thought they had agreed to. Written agreements were kind of being sidestepped. And your company decided that you would take these people as a last resort to binding administration, which was in your original agreement that was signed with the officials in Shenzhen. And that seemed to cause all kinds of concern on the part of the bank officials. And as a person that reads or gets idea of China from the newspapers, the idea that China had signed a binding arbitration clause, one, and two, that they were really petrified, scared that you might take them to the arbitration court, where in fact you had to, and they agreed, and it caused. I mean, just the idea that China would agree to this arbitration and is part of an arbitration mechanism in New York, the international agreement mechanism. I mean, that alone is news for a lot of people, John. So I guess what I'm asking in a roundabout way is, do you think that China is that misunderstood by those who just get the information from the media?
Well, first of all, when you say China, the agreement that we signed with was a local government, and that is Shenzhen government, which is a city of right now probably 20 million people adjacent to Hong Kong. So it's not the central government we're talking about. And maybe many people don't know this, but people doing business as foreign investors in China should know about this. Most of the contracts that we sign in China would put the venue of dispute resolution not within China, but outside of China, typically in Hong Kong law, Hong Kong arbitration, or Hong Kong court. And in this particular case, the site of arbitration would be Paris, for Shenzhen Development Bank transaction. And at the time, the Chinese government at different levels were making an effort to converge their practices with international best practices. And therefore, it was very much accepted then, as it is today, that dispute resolution would take place outside of China in the neutral territory. Hong Kong is considered offshore because it's one country, two systems. Hong Kong has independent judiciary under the common law tradition, the British common law tradition, and independent judiciary, and therefore Hong Kong will be acceptable both by foreign investors and by the Chinese parties at different levels. It was the case then, 20 years ago. It is still the case today.
I'll come back to it. Allow me, Weijian, just to remind our viewers to be sure and sign up for Polaris Live alerts of our upcoming programs by going to my website, kashmeri.com, Kashmeri. And they may also want to subscribe to our YouTube channel to establish a closer connection with our studio staff. And as a reminder, we are discussing this fascinating book that was released just a few days ago, Money Machine by Dr. Weijian Shan, one of Asia's most prominent financial executives. The Weijian, I'm going to press this point again because, the impression here is that China really, first of all, is a top-down society, that what the President Xi Jinping wants to do, or what the proletariat wants to do, that gets done. You have more than once in this interview talked about dealing with the local government, Shenzhen. Just the idea that there is a Shenzhen government with its own way of, with its own laws and its own agreement, I think is going to be news to a lot of people because they assume everything just happens from the top. They say, oh, we're going to get it done. It gets done. And so I just want to be clear, that is not necessarily the case. Am I right in understanding what you've said, Weijian?
That's not the case. I'm exchanging some emails with a group of people even today talking about certain issues in China. And this gentleman is a British, or was a British diplomat, and he speaks very fluent Chinese. And he reminded this group in email exchange that there's a saying in China that there's a policy from above and there are methods at the bottom. So the local governments, local people have their own ways of doing things, which are not necessarily consistent with the policies issued from the above. China is a very big country. There's another saying that the sky is very high and the emperor is far away. So the locals improvise when it comes to practicality.
Well, you see, why I said at the beginning of this wonderful conversation, Weijian, that I thought this was three books in one. That it reads like a novel, the true story about how your group was able to take over the bank and turn it around. But it is also a lesson that political scientists, I believe, can get out of the book about misunderstandings of China. And I think that is terribly important because America and China are at daggers drawn, and every day there's a headline that talks how shall I say, tough language from both sides. But am I reading from your book that in spite of the nasty geopolitical situation, the business side of the relationship, in spite of the tariffs and so on, is still gradually, steadily moving ahead? And I ask this reason because then perhaps we should focus on that for a while the politicians sort themselves out.
I think you're absolutely correct. The US-China relations are probably at the worst point, and it may get even worse at this very moment. And there has been talk about decoupling economically between the two countries. So I think the relationship at this moment is very bad, and it's going to get worse, in my view. However, I think there are two dimensions in this relationship. One is political, which is extremely bad. The other is economics. If you look at the economic side of this relationship, you will be very surprised that the US-China trade relationship, despite of the trade war, which began in 2018, today is at an all-time high. Trade volume last year reached about $700 billion both ways. That is, the two-way trade reached $700
700 billion with a B.
billion dollars, which is an all-time high, breaking record. And the trade war, when Donald Trump launched it, was designed to reduce the trade deficit by the United States with China. And the trade deficit is probably at all-time high as well. So the trade relationship is actually growing despite of all the decoupling rhetoric in the past few years, even through the pandemic. And if you look at the investment side, big companies like Intel, like IBM, like General Motors are invested in China, and there's more investment pouring into China at the rate of about $190 billion just last year. A big chunk of that comes from the United States. So General Motors today sells more cars in China than in North America, that is the United States, Mexico, and Canada combined, by far. Volkswagen also sells more cars in China than in Germany and in the EU. So on the investment front, the relationship is also very strong. And that's what I mean by there are two dimensions in this relationship. The political dimension is very bad, but the economic dimension seems to be very strong. And therefore, the economic dimension may serve as a brake to how far the political relationship can deteriorate.
So, Dr. Weijian Shan, I've thought of a question which I had not prepared, so I'm going to ask this. It's a blue sky question. If you had a few minutes alone with President Biden and President Xi Jinping to explain why your book should be read by them and encourage them to believe that both great countries can indeed live together, what is one piece of advice you would give them?
Well, I think if you read my book, obviously, an investment relationship, a trade relationship is beneficial for both countries, right? My book talks about how we helped turn around a major bank in China. And my book also talks about how much money we as American investors made from that investment. So it's mutually beneficial relationship. And just now I talked about triple wins, not only good for us, not only good for them, but also for all the stakeholders of this particular bank. And they should look at the common ground, what would benefit both countries, and try to patch up their differences and focus on the positive. That's all I can say. But it's unlikely either of them will listen to me.
Well, listen, Weijian, we've run out of time. And I want to show you a book once more because I really think that everyone should read it. Everyone should read it. I'm going to go back this summer and read it again. So please read this book, Money Machine. It's one of the best books that I've read over many months. And Dr. Weijian Shan, I want to thank you very much for this time that you've taken. I hope you will come back and visit us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and great honor.
And now let me thank our viewers from around the world. I hope you can join us again for the next episode of Polaris Live. Until then, goodbye.